Okay, I hope this is working. Great. My name's Alanna McArdle, and just wanted to firstly say thank you to the editors for having me be in this issue and also part of this launch. It's a real privilege to have my work featured as one of the creative encounters. And I'm really looking forward to reading the whole issue and watching the rest of these talks. Great. I guess I'll get going. So the work that I have in this issue is a creative text. There's also a critical essay discussing the text, the ideas behind it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by reading a short extract from the creative work, which is titled Voice. And it's taken from a longer text that I'm working on as part of my creative and life writing MA at Goldsmiths. And the whole text is a sort of memoir that is made up of part poetry, part prose, and what you might call lyric essay. And it concerns my experience as a person with bipolar disorder within and outside of institutions, but I'll go through that more after I read this extract. Voice. Before I learned how trauma works, I thought my memory was faulty. I couldn't retain a thing. If you asked me about my childhood, I would say it was grey. Things float in, vague as the colour of pickle brine. Some community fire, swimming lessons, kissing girls in the school toilets, wanting to die, oh, wanting to die. Isn't that the Sexton poem? And that old first love of mine, that almost unnameable lust. Not understanding that I wasn't supposed to want what I wanted. The weather in my memories is always bad, but this part might be true. I grew up in England. It's just that your memory is depressed, says some idiot in A&E on Christmas Eve, and someone reads something I've written and says, children aren't really this unhappy. What can I say? Maybe I'm a liar. For many, mentally ill is a synonym for untrustworthy. Anyway, I can't wait to have a wedding so that I finally know which was the happiest day of my life. Your history, is that what I'm trying to do here? The more I say I, will I become me? The more they say you, it wanes and wanes and wanes and wanes, and here is the failure of language. Who is describing me this time? And what do they mean? And what do I mean when I write it down like this? Spill into existence or out of it. Killing myself physically, after all, did not work. So to begin the sort of discussion of the work, I'm going to read a very small part of a discharge letter that I received a few years ago from a psychiatric outpatient unit after recovering from a suicide attempt. And discharge letters are written to your GP, but they get sent to you as well, and you end up reading about yourself in the third person. So this part goes. Alanna appeared clean and well kept, wearing summery clothes. She laughed appropriately and showed no signs of erratic behavior. So reading this part of the letter and my other discharge letters, I think is what really sparked my interest in thinking about the self and the medicalized self, the institutionalized self, and the ways language is used to define these selves in sort of constantly opposing constructive and deconstructive ways. There's an important quotation from a Judith Butler essay called How Can I Deny That These Hands and This Body Are Mine, which I cite in the paper. And the quote is, the body is given through language, but not reducible to language. this points to what I see as an inextricable relation to what we mean when we talk about diagnosis, not only as a medical tool, but as a linguistic tool. With diagnosis, you're not just describing someone, but you're also ascribing a type of language to their body, therefore making that body anew. And we disembody ourselves if we try to separate the body from the body entirely from the language that constructs it. But it's here where you have to think about whose language is doing that construction in the first place. So how do you claim agency over a body that is constantly defined by others, especially when those others are institutionally more powerful than the individual? And this consideration of the linguistics of illness and diagnosis led me to be interested in thinking about deixis, which is the way that certain words can only be understood in a certain context. And from this, I began to consider how bodies themselves may be deictic. I began to feel that there was a link to how I view my existence and selfhood as a person with bipolar disorder to a sort of deictic state of existence, one that is seen as deceptive or unstable, and that others may perceive as lacking or incomplete. So this is where my creative work kind of started taking shape formally, because I wanted to create a sort of unstable and fragmented mix of genre and form, and this I perspective that would naturally become unstable or unreliable. And I also really wanted to explore this idea that a lot of people have, that writing is inherently therapeutic, or that writing itself and one's own history naturally allows an author to reclaim agency of themselves. And agency and the seeming impossibility of harnessing it is one of the key focuses of the text. And when you're thinking about the institutionalized self, you also have to think about the intersections that has with marginalized identities, how these intersections, how the historically misogynistic practice of medicine even further interrupts a woman's ability to define herself. Phyllis Chesler, who's a psychiatrist and a writer, describes how the historical discrimination of women by medical institutions occupied many women in what she calls the female career as psychiatric patient. So, for instance, a woman who simply feels anything outside of an oppressive norm is immediately pathologized, while women who truly suffer from illness are patronized and disbelieved, or met with abject violence in the space of a patriarchal clinic. And this also seemed to me to be like a real mirror of how so-called confessional writing, whether that be memoir or poetry, any genre, when written by a woman, is often deemed to be either frivolous or too much. And there's a brilliant quote from Jen Ashworth's book, Notes Made While Falling, where she states, "Anytime a woman utters a sentence about her own experience, she becomes a kind of terrorist, and there's an army out there waiting to strike her down." So I have no answers as to whether writing through or around trauma, or rewriting and sort of translating one's history and one's body from medical and into poetic or lyrical language does or can aid the individual realization of a self with agency. But I do feel that this kind of discursive practice can stake a very powerful claim in such oppressive institutional settings, and can become a radical act in response to what often incredibly violent, what I would call linguistic interventions of the body and of the self. Yeah, so thank you for listening. And thanks again to the editors for my work and in this issue, and I'll try and answer questions if anyone has any. But also happy to, not answer any questions. Someone is typing a question now. I feel like I should have hold music or something. So will the spoken word piece form part of your PhD research? So the extract that I read is page poetry. So not really performance poetry, but obviously kind of have to read out. And it is part of a larger portfolio that I'm working on, which will be my final submission for the master's that I'm doing at the moment. And I am hoping to keep this going and keep it going into PhD research if that's possible. Yeah, I mean it's like a really ongoing project that it's been interesting to write because it kind of feels like it has no end, especially because it's kind of memoir. So at what point do you decide you stop writing about yourself? And obviously, especially when writing about illness and medical institutions, we're under this government, the NHS has changed so dramatically and so much for the worse that these issues are becoming more and more kind of prescient and also difficult and much harder to deal with. I don't know if that's really answered that question, but there's a question: how do you connect your work, if at all, to the Me Too movement? I don't know if I would connect it specifically to that movement, but in terms of feminist politics as a whole, I think that gender is hugely important to my work, especially sort of gendered violence and how that kind of the trauma that you experience through that. But I would say that I'm not sure if it's to do with kind of Me Too specifically, more so just kind of like the historical medical oppression of women. So the fact that over centuries kind of all what are classified as supposedly female issues are turned into like I said in my presentation, pathologized. So a really obvious example is the invention of hysteria as a disease, which was basically given to any woman who just acted outside of their station, and it was kind of a real catch-all for basically any woman who was not behaving in a way that they should. Oh wait, you've just said connect is the wrong word. Sorry. Oh no, I don't. I mean, like, I don't think it's that. I mean, it's just I feel like I'm answering this so badly. It's so broad. I mean, there's no way that gender cannot come into this work. Is basically how I see it, and that's thinking about it from the kind of broader perspective of the themes that I'm talking about, which is illness and institutions, but also, of course, it is a sort of memoir, and the way that my gender is perceived and the way that I experience my gender is necessarily going to bleed into the work. So are these themes across your body of work, or do you write/create on other themes as well? So this is, actually, to be honest, I think if I do look at most of my creative work as a whole, I think trauma is quite a central theme to most of it, and memory as well. This particular work and the portfolio that it's from is, really sort of like kind of sheltered in this like these themes of the self and the medicalized self, but my poetry outside of it is still quite connected, but hopefully I'm not only writing about this. Please, would you say more about the creative form you use to symbolize the instability that you mentioned? So I really kind of simply speaking, I use a mixture of form, and really, I do think that kind of materially does create some type of instability, because for a reader it can be a bit disorientating to have to like switch between forms, but also I kind of wanted to mirror this because I talk about medicalized language and diagnosis. There's so many types of medicalized language that the way that you experience it is so different. So for instance, like something like a discharge letter, which is a piece of prose. And then you have graphs, and you have forms that you have to fill in, and it's kind of, sort of like a mixed media experience. And so it seemed natural to not just write in one form, and to also be sort of more honest about the type of disorientation that you can feel when in these institutions and having these experiences. So that's kind of what that's what I mean when I talk about instability in terms of form. I hope that is helpful. So how important do you think it is to recognize the self in academic research and to be a vulnerable researcher? Oh, that's a nice question. Well, I mean, firstly, I don't really see myself as my course is very practice-based, and I see myself as a practitioner more so than a researcher, and which is why I really like this journal, because when I saw that they take creative submissions, I felt like that was kind of a nice way of opening up academia to people who might feel a little bit more like shut out from it. But I think this idea of being a vulnerable researcher is a really interesting one. I mean, I think, it's important to recognize the self in whatever you're researching, because, nothing comes from a vacuum, and, you are part of the context of what you're researching. God, I don't know. That's really interesting. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to think about it more. But that's a really good question. Thank you for that question. Can you speak about the idea of the body as text, where the body is itself a site of knowledge and subsequently one subject to, I guess it's supposed to be literary criticism? Can you speak about the idea of body as text, where the body is itself a site of knowledge? This it feels like an enormous question to have to answer. Well, I suppose you'd have to apologize. Well, I guess, I mean, what I think about is this kind of idea of kind of constructivist, like, how do we use language, and what comes first, and I always go back to this kind of, there's a seeming hierarchy when it comes to descriptive language, or just kind of language that states the existence of. I mean, I suppose it's just a completely kind of, just inexorable process. I mean, the idea of body as a text is really interesting, and as a site of knowledge, and obviously that is something that's like always going to change and evolve depending on that individual self, but also the context around it. But I feel like I have to think about this more. I'm going to have to think about this question more. I don't think I answered that very well. I'm sorry. How do you think this can help destabilize the structures in medical practice where artistic responses are disregarded in favor of consumer surveys and metrics? Yeah, that's interesting. It's also interesting because sort of this is anecdotal, but one of my friends is an art therapist, and she felt that she was often kind of seen as a bit, by the other sort of clinicians as, a bit sort of superfluous. And I do think that there is definitely kind of privileging of certain ways of privileging of certain treatments, basically. And there is just kind of this, because of that, you just necessarily become less powerful than the people who are giving that treatment, because you are supposed to believe that they know exactly what is best for you. And it's specific. I think it's quite interesting, especially with mental illness, because a lot of it is guesswork. That much about the brain, and I think it's you kind of, you accept a lot, not necessarily everyone, but one accepts a diagnosis because it's the kind of thing you accept when you kind of go in for some sort of physical problem where there's, like really kind of concrete ways of, seeing what is wrong with someone. And so you accept that language as well when you are being diagnosed with a mental health problem, without really being given the option to question it, and without being given the option to, argue with it. I mean, I just think from my personal experience, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know how you would begin destabilizing the structures. Patience, it's honestly so basic, but there's just like a complete lack of empathy. And I just feel like the approach, and it's a lot to do with how people are taught, and I suppose like a lot of clinicians just get used to it and they think that that's kind of how they're supposed to talk to patients. But a lot of it is just this kind of, you know, to be really blunt about it, like, you were the crazy one and I'm the professional, so just, you know, listen to me. And yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what to do about it. I think that it shouldn't be, you know, I talk a lot about agency, but at the same time, I don't want to give the impression that I think that this is a kind of, you know, individual responsibility that everyone needs to, you know, kind of be the one taking back control from situations in which they feel powerless, because it is an institutional problem and it needs, you know, a top-down solution. But yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's really important. Michelle says, I'm not a psychotherapist, and I concur that symbolic representation for person's experience through art is seen as less credible than model studies. Yeah, you know, it's a shame. I don't know what else to say about it. It's just, yeah, it's a shame that that we have these kind of this hierarchy, and you know, it's not particularly. It just everything becomes so clinical, and everything becomes so you know, you become more of a patient than a person, which is something I'm really interested in, kind of to do with this idea of the medicalized self. Yeah, I feel like I didn't really do justice to some of the questions because they were really good. I'm definitely going to be thinking more about the idea of body as text. I mean, if there's any way that you can give me like an email address so I can email you about it or something. But yeah, thank you for the questions. They were really interesting. And thank you again to all the editors. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be in the journal and to also to speak here. Okay, great. Thank you. We will speak on Twitter. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, enjoy the rest of the talks. My name's Alanna McArdle. Yeah, and yeah, if you have any other questions for me, you can tweet them at me. My Twitter is Alanna McArdle with a underscore after it. Cool. Thank you.